In the year 1095, Europe was not preparing for war. It was barely surviving peace. And yet, within a generation, tens of thousands would march across continents, convinced that killing could be holy. This story is not about knights chasing glory. It is about how belief, pressure, and systems turned faith into a tool of war. On this channel, we tell stories about moments that seem inevitable only after they happen. Stories where decisions matter more than heroes, where history shifts not because of destiny, but because of structure, fear, and timing. The Crusades are usually described as religious wars, Christians versus Muslims, cross versus crescent. But this is not just about religion. It is about why Europe stopped tearing itself apart and started pointing outward. It is about how violence was not removed, but redirected. To understand the Crusades, we have to understand what Europe was before them. By the late 11th century, Western Europe was a dangerous place to live. There was no strong central authority. Kings ruled in name, not in reach. Local lords controlled land, armies, and justice, and those lords fought constantly. Feuds lasted generations. Castles rose not against foreign enemies but against neighbors. Private wars were common, expected, and profitable. Violence was not a breakdown of order. It was the order. Knighthood, often romanticized, was not a moral code. It was a profession built on force. Young men trained for war from childhood, with few outlets except fighting each other. The church saw the danger, not just physical danger, but spiritual chaos. Christian doctrine condemned murder, but Christian society depended on warriors who killed for a living. This contradiction had no solution, only management. So the church tried restraint. They declared the peace of God protecting clergy, peasants, and property. Then the truce of God banning fighting on holy days. It failed. Not because people ignored faith, but because the system rewarded violence too much. War made men powerful. Peace made them irrelevant. Europe was not looking for a holy war. It was looking for control. Far from Europe, another system was under strain. The Eastern Mediterranean had been shaped by Islam for centuries. Empires rose and fell, but trade continued. Pilgrims moved between worlds. Jerusalem changed rulers many times, yet Christian pilgrims were usually allowed to visit. Then, in the 11th century, something shifted. Turkish tribes, newly converted to Islam, surged westward. They defeated the Byzantine army at Manzikert in 1071. The result was catastrophic. Byzantium lost most of Anatolia, its manpower, its tax base, its defensive depth. For the first time in centuries, Constantinople felt vulnerable. The Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos needed help, not conquest, not crusade, mercenaries. So he did something unprecedented. He appealed to the Latin West. In 1095, Pope Urban II stood before a crowd at the Council of Clermont. What he said there would reshape history, but not in the way most people imagine. Urban did not invent hatred of Islam. He did not describe a clash of civilizations. He described suffering. He spoke of fellow Christians in the East, attacked and humiliated. He spoke of sacred places under threat. He spoke of a moral duty. Then he made a radical offer. Anyone who went east to fight not for land, not for gold, but for God, would receive remission of sins. This was unprecedented. Violence, once a spiritual liability, became a spiritual solution. Killing was no longer just tolerated. It was sanctified. The crowd erupted, but not because they were bloodthirsty, because, for the first time, their world made sense. The crusade was not a spontaneous frenzy. It was an answer to a system-wide problem. Europe had too many warriors and no unifying purpose. The church had moral authority but no army. Kings wanted stability but lacked reach. The crusade aligned these interests. Violence was exported. Authority was centralized. Faith provided legitimacy. This was not chaos. It was organization. The response exceeded all expectations. Not just knights, but peasants, artisans, women, and children took the vow. Some followed charismatic preachers. Others sold everything they owned. This was not a migration driven by strategy. It was driven by belief, and belief does not calculate logistics. The so-called People's Crusade collapsed almost immediately. Untrained, undisciplined, they clashed with locals, ran out of supplies, and were slaughtered by Turkish forces. The system corrected itself. The real crusade, the one led by nobles, moved slowly, deliberately. They negotiated with Byzantium. They secured supply lines. They adapted to unfamiliar terrain. This was not a mob. It was an army learning to operate beyond its world. When the Crusaders reached the Levant, they encountered a fragmented political landscape. The Muslim world was not unified. Rival dynasties competed. Local rulers distrusted each other more than foreign invaders. The Crusaders exploited this. They besieged cities methodically. They made alliances when useful. They waited when impatience would have been fatal. In 1099 they reached Jerusalem. The siege was brutal. When the city fell, the violence shocked even contemporaries. Men, women, and children were killed indiscriminately. This was not strategy, it was release. Years of hardship, fear, and religious fervor collapsed into a single moment. The Crusaders believed they were cleansing a holy city. What they actually did was reveal the cost of sanctified violence. Jerusalem became the center of a new experiment. Crusader states were established tiny, vulnerable, dependent on constant reinforcement. They were not colonies in the modern sense. They were military outposts held together by faith and fear. To survive, they required something new: permanent holy war. Orders like the Templars emerged, monks who fought. They lived under discipline, hierarchy, and vows. This was unprecedented. A standing army justified entirely by religion. Faith was no longer just motivation, it was infrastructure. The Muslim response took time. At first, the Crusaders were seen as another wave of invaders, dangerous but temporary. That changed. Leaders like Nur ad-Din and later Saladin understood something crucial. The Crusaders were not just soldiers, they were symbols. To defeat them, force was not enough. Unity was required. Saladin reorganized armies, secured finances, and framed resistance as a moral duty. When Jerusalem fell back to Muslim control in 1187, it was not through massacre, it was through negotiation. Saladin understood legitimacy. He won not just territory but reputation. The Crusades did not end there. They continued for centuries, changing shape, target, and meaning. Some failed spectacularly. Others turned against Christians themselves. The Fourth Crusade sacked Constantinople, shattering the very empire that had asked for help. The system had slipped its original purpose. Faith, once a unifying force, became a justification for power. So what did the Crusades actually change? They did not bring lasting peace to the Holy Land. They did not unite Christendom permanently. They did not end religious conflict, but they transformed Europe. They strengthened monarchies. They expanded trade networks. They reoriented violence outward. Most importantly, they redefined moral authority. For the first time, war could be framed not as a failure of faith but as its fulfillment. That idea did not disappear. It evolved. The Crusades taught institutions how to mobilize belief at scale, how to turn abstract ideals into action, how to make sacrifice feel meaningful. These lessons would be used again and again, sometimes in religion, sometimes in politics, sometimes in ideology. The language would change. The structure would not. The Crusades were not inevitable. They were chosen by leaders responding to pressure, chosen by societies seeking order, chosen by individuals searching for meaning. Faith did not cause the violence, but it made it usable. History rarely turns on villains or heroes. It turns on systems that align incentives with belief. The Crusades remind us of that, not because they were unique, but because they worked just enough to be repeated. If you want to understand the modern world, you cannot ignore this moment, because this was when belief stopped being private and became a weapon. If this story changed how you see history, let us know by leaving a like. If there is another moment you think deserves this kind of deep examination, tell us in the comments. And if you want more stories about the systems behind history, consider subscribing, because the past is not finished with us yet.